About 2,500 years ago, the reformed ascetic, Siddhartha Gautama, wishing to dispel all ignorance, sat down under a sacred fig tree to meditate with supreme determination, and was enlightened to the truth of all existence. Over the next millennium and a half, the teachings of the Awakened One, the Buddha, slowly spread throughout Asia, bringing enlightenment to ignorance and nonviolence to conflict. Now the Dharma has come sailing on the jet streams of modernity into the heart of this culture that runs on the engines of competition and greed, where many consider cruelty to be kindness and ignorance to be knowledge. If its history is any judge, the sublime path that our colonial forefathers dubbed Buddhism has begun a migration that over time will leave it, and quite possibly modernity itself, greatly transformed.
What is it going to look like? That's anyone's guess.
It will not survive. It will be an anachronistic, esoteric, Asiatic something here in the West, but nobody will take it serious if it clings to old structures.
We're not going to create an indigenous Western Buddhism, and we don't want to create an indigenous Western Buddhism. We're not here to be, okay, you guys were the Chinese Buddhists, you're the thing, we're the American Buddhists. Not at all. That's useless. Totally useless. It's too late in history for that.
If Buddhism is to become a living and vital cultural presence in modernity, it needs to rethink some of its most fundamental doctrines.
But I want to be able to recognize it. You know, do I call it psychology? Do I call it stress reduction? Do I call it art? I want to be able to recognize it as Buddhism. So that I'm old hat. Old traditionalist conservative.
The great Japanese Buddhist scholar D.T. Suzuki, whose writings were influential in transmitting Zen to the West, once described the social imperative of Buddhism as the battle between enlightenment and ignorance. Modernity, then, would be the battleground, and how Buddhism responds to its formidable challenges will determine how successful it will be. So this is a road movie that will wind through Europe and North America to visit many of the first generation of Western-born Buddhist teachers, the intrepid Dharma pioneers, to look through their eyes at how the Buddha Dharma is making out in its encounter with the West. Like all world religions, Buddhism is no stranger to migration into new lands. What may be different, though, is its chameleon-like ability to adopt widely differing cultural and religious forms.
You don't see that in any other religion?
No, I think there's a fundamental reason for that.
John Crook is the principal Dharma teacher in England's Western Chan Fellowship. He lives in the west of the country, off a dirt road, in a large old house that also serves for individual retreats.
The initial prophets of, say, Islam or of Christianity were very great men, very clearly. But what happened in both cases after that is the formation of churches, all dependent upon dogmas. Things must be believed or things must be behaved in certain ways. And in both Christianity and in Islam, this has led to terrible warfare and disputes between Catholic and Protestant and between the branches of Islam. Appalling. You can see the sea out there. By and large, Buddhism has been free from that. Why is that? Because, in my view, it's dependent not on dogmas, but on what are in fact empirical statements about how the mind works.
San Francisco was Buddhism's birthplace in the West in modern times. It had previously arrived here in the early years of the 19th century with Chinese and Japanese immigrants, but it remained within their communities. In the succeeding decades, here and there small pockets of Western converts gathered around an Asian teacher. But it wasn't until the counterculture of the 1950s and 60s that the ground was fertile enough to sustain a permanent transplant. By the late 50s, the leading lights of the Beat generation had congregated here, many of them inspired by the ideas of Zen Buddhism.
Nobody was really practicing, was it?
I think not many people. No, there was no such thing as practice. Gary Snyder went to Japan and practiced in Rinzai Monastery, and it's probably a few other people.
Mel Weitzman is the Roshi at the Berkeley Zen Center. Now in his 80s, in the late 50s, he was an art student plugged into the counterculture scene.
Yeah, that's okay. There was interest, but the interest didn't have any place to go. So when Suzuki Roshi came, he was one of the first people, maybe the first one really, 59.
In 1959, a Zen priest named Shunryu Suzuki had arrived from Japan to minister to San Francisco's immigrant Japanese community. But he also found interest from an unexpected source, thanks to the phone company.
Here we are. People started calling him because they saw Zen in the telephone book, and they were looking for something. Then he said, well, I start sitting at 5:45 in the morning, so you're welcome to come and sit with me. And people did. We have about 8 residents here. And then finally, the Japanese congregation gave them a room upstairs. This is my Dokusan hut where I do interviews. So little by little, the Zen Center formed around Suzuki Roshi. You want to see inside?
Sure.
I have to separate my keys from...
Very serious.
And then there was always the tension between the Japanese congregation and the American congregation, because the American congregation was a lot of hippies, not everybody, I mean, there were doctors and lawyers, professional people, but a good deal of hippiness, you know. And Suzuki Roshi loved the hippies because they represented something that people were actually seeking seriously. Because the Japanese congregation was like a church, you know. So he was really taken by the innocence of the hippies.
With the interest in Eastern spirituality clearly there, Suzuki Roshi quickly turned his attention full-time to the Westerners. He had Mel Weitzman looking for property in Berkeley, while others found an old home for single Jewish women in the city proper that became the San Francisco Zen Center. There was, however, at least one cultural ritual of the hippies that was incompatible with Zen meditation.
It was not at all unusual in the beginning for one day sitting to end and for a bunch of people to go out to Golden Gate Park and get stoned. You know? It changed with time. You know, it's hard to sit a sesshin stoned, really, you know? It doesn't work very well.
Despite these early hiccups, it was clear that conditions were now ripe for the Dharma to rise in the West. Soon other Zen teachers were sailing for Western shores. Bernie Glassman Roshi's teacher, Maizumi Roshi, in Los Angeles. And in Paris, Yuno Roland Resch's master, Taizan Deshimeru, were just a few of many. But Westerners were also taking advantage of the new jet travel to head off to the east, finding teachers in Japan, Thailand, Burma, and Ceylon. And as a result of the tragedy of the Tibetan exodus of 1959, to India and Nepal, where the Dalai Lama and many of the great Tibetan masters were accessible to the outside world for the very first time. By the late 60s and early 70s, the Western-born acolytes were beginning to return home to face the challenge of how to teach the Buddha Dharma in a culture so radically different from its Asian roots.
The rise of modern technology, transportation, communication, internet, and all of this whole society is radically unlike any society that Buddhism has gravitated to or migrated to and then assimilated with over the last 2,500 years. So this is an unprecedented challenge.
The challenge has begun to take shape. There are the usual scandals that plague those in spiritual authority, those old temptresses of sex, drugs, and power, from which Buddhism has no transcendentally derived immunity.
The different women didn't know about each other.
And there are profound debates raging in a quietly Buddhist way, just to give a few examples, about the role of the spiritual teacher.
There's a feeling that when you're on the circuit as a Dharma teacher, that you are in a marketplace situation that is driven more by desire for fame and money and success in a very worldly sense.
The suitability of Asian cultural forms.
Early on, we decided it was fine for people to sit in chairs, because that's what we do in this culture. People didn't have to wear robes or special garments.
The place of monasticism in a culture of decidedly lay practitioners.
Westerners think that monasticism is something Catholics did, and we Protestants don't, even if they happen to be Jewish.
And even the fundamental question of what is the essence of Buddhism itself. Though many Buddhists might disagree on the fine print, most would agree that the essence can be found in the first teachings of the Buddha.
I think one has to say that world Buddhism begins with the basic ideas of the Buddha. Because if you look at the history of Buddhism, it is always of fine adjustments and changes in those fundamental, what are sometimes called the fundamental formulae of the Buddha. So what are they? Well, of course, it's the law of codependent arising as the root of the Four Noble Truths.
The Four Noble Truths explain the nature of suffering, its cause, its end, and the path of practice that leads to its end. The law of dependent origination is their foundation. It states that all things arise from an infinite web of cause and effect, and so no thing exists independently. Everything is void or empty of an inherent self-nature. The implications of this are as subtle as they are profound, and this has made the role of the teacher essential for their full unfolding within the mind of the student. But in today's West, that role is facing new and difficult challenges. Let's begin in the Bay Area, the crucible of Western Buddhism, with its largest institution, the fruit of Suzuki Roshi's pioneering efforts, the San Francisco Zen Center.
So, this is the Kaisandel. Although it's not a great likeness of him, you know, but what this room does is give us a place to focus our gratitude to Suzuki Roshi. That's the point of this room. He was in this room as he was dying, so that he would be available to students, for them to see him and him to see them, up until very soon before he died. Yeah. So we bow to him each time we pass. We're extremely fortunate to have this building. It was a Jewish residence hall for young ladies away from their families. Young ladies in the 20s didn't live alone. Apparently this is very famous for, many matches were made here because people have come celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary and bring their grandchildren to show them where Grandpa and Grandpa met. So this is our zendo, our meditation hall. This is the ceremonial hall. This is where we have morning service every day and any ceremonies that we do, ordinations, funerals, weddings.
Today's Zen Center, as it's called, is one of the largest, if not the largest, Buddhist organizations outside Asia. The downtown property consists of a number of buildings and is home to between 45 and 65 residents at any given time. As well, there's Tassajara Monastic Center in the Ventana Wilderness and the Green Gulch Farm Practice Center in Marin County.
I have to say that the second abbot, you know, Richard Baker, did a lot to build Zen Center. I never wanted him to leave. I wanted him to say, gee, that was a mistake. I'm really sorry. And, you know, but he couldn't do that.
Suzuki Roshi's Dharma heir, Zentatsu Richard Baker, became abbot after Suzuki's death in 1971. He was a gifted organization builder who successfully raised the money to buy the superb real estate Zen Center enjoys today. Baker was forced to resign in 1984 after a scandal that rocked the community.
He was having consensual, but he was having sexual relationships with students, and people got really upset about it, and appropriately so. It's not appropriate for a teacher to have sexual relationships with students.
And this is the Zendo here.
What was interesting from the point of view of Buddhism in the West was not the scandal, but the effect on the budding community and how they dealt with its aftermath, both psychologically and organizationally.
It was the death of innocence, you know. We had a kind of faith that was naive and unrealistic. And so when it all happened and we kind of realized that the person we had faith in and that we had projected was not the person that was actually there, it was, you know, enormously disturbing on a lot of levels. As many people had all kinds of breakdowns, many people, you know, left overnight.
Here was this sort of traditionally hierarchical situation which had put him in isolation. So there was no one who could give him the feedback he needed to say, whoa, this isn't appropriate.
For some time, we were in a almost like a holding pattern. You know, we weren't sure how to proceed with our leadership, religious leadership. We did we eventually did a redesign of our administrative and religious leadership structure.
We did go toward a much more democratic structure with an elected board. Up until then, the board, of course, was all appointed.
You know, much more communication, horizontal communication, much more feedback loops for leaders and teachers. But the downside is that there's a tremendous amount of discussion that has to take place. Because, I mean, if you run a business, you know, you're really responsible for people for 8 hours a day, for that small portion of their lives when they work for you. If you're a place like this, you're responsible for people 24 hours a day, and not only for their economic life and their physical life, but for their spiritual life, all their lives, for the people who stay for a whole lifetime. So taking care of people and dealing with people's problems and issues in a way that is inclusive and fair, requires enormous amounts of communication and conversation, and it's actually makes it hard to do things. It makes the running of the organization a little bit unwieldy, I think. You know, democracy is pretty unwieldy, you know, by its nature.
Traditionally, the role of the teacher is anything but democratic. It is, after all, not a relationship of equal spiritual development, especially in the early stages of the student's practice. And so the authority of the teacher can extend to all areas of the student's life. Jean Hogan Roshi is the teacher at International Zen Center, Noorderpoort, in the Netherlands. Her training with her Rinzai Zen teacher involved living in the same house, so she was completely unfamiliar with running a Dharma center when it came time to start one up.
What I had learned about a Zen organization was very traditional, was really like it is done in Japan or Korea, whatever. So very authoritative, you know, very top-down. Everything is organized top-down. There's actually only one who decides about everything, and that's the abbot or the master of the house, of the center. Which, of course, in the first years I did. I was pretty authoritative, or top-down with everything. And but then, you know, at a certain point, for some reasons, you realize it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's too much for yourself. But also, this is not what people are used to. So I started wondering, well, you know, what should I do? And then I heard the voice of my master, well, you have to, that's what she told me before she died, you have to make our organization a democratic organization. And that was her, the words from her to me. Make it a democratic organization. Wow. Okay, democratic organization. So who is for this and who is for that? 5 for this and 6 for that. What do you do? somehow it didn't really bring people together. On the contrary, I would see that trying to do it in that way, that you would get camps. You really get camps. So I just explained to David that the practice has changed over the years, you know, that we have...
As a solution, Hogan Rashi turned to a management system called the sociocratic model. Developed by a Dutch Quaker, it is intended to avoid the paralysis that can result from decision-making by consensus, and the balkanization that is the frequent pitfall of democracy. In this model, decisions are made when no one is left with a reasoned, substantial objection. So while someone may not agree, in the end, they must give their consent.
This is the sendo. See, please enter with socks only.
Hang on, just a sec.
So, very interesting. So we were quite far with that. Residents were involved, and then they started like, you know, I'm not here to talk about these things. I'm here to train. I'm not here to decide about if we are going to chant in the morning or not. So we started noticing, hey, something is not right. Something is not right. So we had guidance from somebody of the Sociocratic Center to look at it. What is the problem? Well, he said, what is different here when you compare it with another organization, that there is also, this is a spiritual organization. And so actually what the conflict is, what the residents noticed very well, what they could not do, of course they cannot decide. They are not here to decide about if we are going to chant in Japanese or not. They're not somehow not ready for that yet. That's not what they should do. And I realized that too. I realized that deep in myself there was something that said, no, I am the one who is deciding about it. So then we found out that actually there are, within this organization, there are two areas. There is what we call the spiritual frame, and then you have what we call the functional organization. So this is the tea room then. For example, last year we renovated the tea room. You've seen all the colors and it looks pretty new still. That we talked about in this circle, and everybody who works in that area came with ideas. So all together we made a design for this tea room. This was on the functional organization. So more and more it becomes clear, this is the spiritual organization and this is the functional organization, and they together are Zen Center Noorderpoort.
The traditional authority of the teacher is also challenged by the complexity of regulations in the modern state. Chittavekka, the Buddhist monastery in Hampshire in the south of England, is part of a large network of monasteries in the Thai forest tradition of Theravadan Buddhism. They are all linked through the teachings of the Thai teacher Ajahn Chah, who took on a number of Western students in the late 60s. Very traditional in their ways, they still have to grapple with the complexities that the state requires of a large organization. Ajahn Suchito is the somewhat reluctant abbot.
I don't want to be running everything and figuring out, goodness me, no. I mean, some of these abbots have just worked silly. I'm quite happy to have more people have a say on things. I don't have to think about it.
No, I know what you mean.
And now here we have a lot more lay committees deciding things for us. Things I just think is too complicated, too worldly for monks to have to try and figure out.
So,
legal, financial, going to all the details of signing contracts on buildings. It's you're really out of your depth, and we can get ripped apart by these people who know how to. We're just too innocent. And it's one of the main problems I think in the West is the complexities of the society, and it runs well because it's got a lot of fine detail in it. You know, how you build something, health and safety procedures are enormously detailed.
Because of the different conditions here, some Western Buddhist students of traditional Asian teachers began experimenting with doing things in untraditional ways when they began their centers. Although they studied in the